southern China and Europe, very, very briefly. It is well known that together with astronomy, philosophy, and mathematics, the early modern intellectual commerce between Europe and China included medical methods. The Jesuits in the China mission were the primary agents of this exchange. Already in the early 17th century, some Jesuits attempted to bring to China elements of European anatomy. They probably felt that European anatomy was a novelty, right? So they tried to bring that to China. As did, very important, a figure, Johann Schreck, also known by his Latinized name of Laurentius, a polymath scholar who, before joining the Society of Jesus, had studied medicine in Padua, struck a friendship with Galileo, and became a fellow of the Lincean Academy. Galileo was very sorry when Schreck became a Jesuit because it had, his lost the science, was going in this religious direction. Schreck wrote in Chinese a text on Western anatomy called Outline of Western Theories of the Human Body, which was revised and published in China, of course, in 1643 after his death by a Chinese convert. In the same years, two other Jesuits, Nicola Longobardo and Giacomo Rò, composed a sequel to Schreck's work titled Illustrated Explanations of the Human Body, which, however, circulated only in manuscript. The main object of medical exchange, however, as you may well imagine, was not anatomy but pharmacology. And this is not surprising because the study of medicinal substances had a very rich, enormously rich millenarian tradition in both China, where it went under the name of Benzao, and in Europe, where it was called Materia Medica. And there is absolutely fascinating, I think, parallel between these two genres, the Benzao texts and the Materia Medica texts, which both go on and on and on and on for centuries, in fact for millennia, in both cases, in China and in Europe. And just to give you an idea, also these texts are often illustrated, so incredibly beautiful. And this is the Vienna Dioscorides from the 6th century, the Codex Vindobonensis, which was actually written for a Byzantine princess, Anicia Juliana. Or look at this, example of illustrated Chinese Benzao, also with incredibly beautiful illustrations. And there is very much a need for comparative history here, which is, that we have lots and lots of studies on the Chinese tradition of Benzao, also on the European Materia Medica, but a comparative study, except for some cases, has not been really attempted. And it's a huge task, so a task for a team of scholars. So the trade and exchange of medicinal objects certainly predated the 17th century, of course. As you can see from this image from a 1505 Benzao, which shows a foreigner offering teriac, the very symbol of Western and Middle Eastern pharmacopoeia, to a Chinese. Already in the early decades of the 17th century, some Jesuit missionaries included instructions for the preparation of Western medicines, especially distillation techniques, so also in this case something new, something up to date, in their works for a Chinese audience, as did Sabatino de Ursis and Giulio Parelli. But it is especially in the last decades of the 17th century and the early 18th that information on Western medicinal drugs arrived in China. At the Beijing court of the Emperor Kangxi, great emperor, you see them very intellectual, as you can see, where some Europeans at Kangxi's court practiced both medicine and surgery. Some of them lay people, like for instance Thomas Darwin, a Scottish surgeon, and some Jesuit missionaries, exempted by papal dispensation from the rule that prohibited the practice of medicine and especially surgery to the clergy. But they were dispensed because the demand on the mission was strong. So Rome said, okay. In the 1680s and 90s, at the emperor's request, French Jesuits imported to Beijing some Western medicinal substances, such as the snake stones, theriac, and cinchona. Cinchona coming from Peru, so a global network. Cinchona was also called the Jesuit bark, which was used to treat the emperor himself of fevers in 1693. Now, what especially concerns us here, however, is the traffic in the other direction, from China to Europe. In this case also, the Jesuit missionaries were the primary agents of exchange. Already in the late 16th and early 17th century, several missionary works on Chinese geography, so works that were really meant just to introduce Chinese geography, but they contained also some information on medicinal substances. The Jesuits sent home reports on Chinese drugs such as ginseng and rhubarb, for which European literati expressed a lively interest. The first work specifically devoted to Chinese plants, including some of medicinal use, was the Flora Sinensis by the Jesuit Michael Bowen. And remember this name because Bowen played a major role in the genesis of specimens, so we will meet him again. Now, in fact, the Jesuits collected local medicinal knowledge in all their missionary outposts around the globe. In Rome, as in Lisbon, in Goa, as in Macau, in Bahia, as in Rio de Janeiro, they would set up apothecary shops, each with its own pharmacopoeia based on local and imported ingredients. At Macau, for centuries, the main point of contact between Europe and China, entry point into China for the missionaries, the Jesuit College of St. Paul, founded in 1562, had an apothecary shop where Western medicines imported via Goa, India, intermingled with Chinese remedies, as we learn from the college's dispensatory or book of secret recipes, which has survived, so we have the source. And just to give you, this is the ruins of the Cathedral of St. Paul in Macau, which was, of course, built at the same time as the college. So this book of secret recipes, such books of recipes or formulas were meant for the composition of patent medicines on sale in the Jesuit boutiques, or at most for circulation within the company's missionary networks. They were usually not meant for publication. So these are sources that we find, but they're just manuscript sources. Individual missionaries also collected medicinal recipes for personal use. While traveling on foot from Goa to Siam in 1658, Siam is present-day Thailand, roughly. For instance, the Flemish Jesuit Francois de Rougemont put together a vademecum of notes on medicinal plants and formulas gathered from several informants, including his fellow missionaries. De Rougemont, I mentioned in passing, has the distinction of being the first European, as far as I know, to be the dedicatee of a painting, a beautiful painting, by a Chinese artist, the painter of landscapes, Wu. Like the dispensatories of the Jesuit apothecary shops around the world, de Rougemont's medical vademecum was meant for his own healing practices in the mission, not for publication in Europe. So this is information that they collect for practical purposes in the mission. Specimen, the book we're talking about, stands in strong contrast with the private use and scribal circulation of such texts. Since its conception, Specimen was meant to be written and published for a wide European readership. The stated goal was to introduce Chinese medicine to Europe as a complex body of medical knowledge of both theoretical and practical value. So it's not just the practical aspect, there is also a keen interest in the cosmology in high Chinese medicine. Specimen was not actually the very first European publication on Chinese medicine. It was preceded by a few years by a slim volume that you see there on the screen, the Secret de la Médecine des Chinois, written by an anonymous Frenchman in Canton in 1665 and published in Grenoble in 1671. This text offers a brief outline, really not so much a translation but a summary of Chinese post-Mixing. The author was rather, we don't know the name of the author, we haven't been able to establish, nobody has been able so far to identify. The author was rather dismissive of Chinese medicine in general and Chinese pharmacopoeia in particular. So he wrote this text, but he doesn't seem to be particularly impressed with Chinese medicine. In Specimen, in contrast, we find keen interest and even admiration for Chinese medical knowledge. Moreover, whereas the interest of the author of Le Secret was narrowly limited to healing practices, whoever wrote Specimen had a scholar's passionate interest in the philosophical and cosmological framework of Chinese medicine, and, moreover, was a scholar because he applied the rules of European philology to translate the text. So, in Specimen. Specimen is very hard to read because it's a miscellaneous volume which brings together various kinds of writings, some presented as translations from Chinese medical classics on pulse taking by an unspecified eruditus europaeus. So, a European scholar, that's always we're told. Besides phygmology, that is the science of the pulse, which of course had very important edition also in Europe, going back to Galen. Besides phygmology, the book also dealt with Chinese physiological, anatomical, and therapeutic notions, including diagnostic and healing practices, from acupuncture to herbal medicine to town diagnosis. The volume also included what was possibly the first attempt to transfer Chinese pharmacopoeia to Europe in the form not simply of materia medica items, but of precise formulas for compound medications with ingredients and dosages. And this is in fact a part of Specimen on which we started to work because it just seemed so interesting and we hadn't come across this anywhere else. And so our first article for ISIS was on the formulas. The volume is illustrated with images, illustrations taken from Chinese medical works. And a lot of work is still to be done there in identifying where the illustrations come from and comparing them and so on and so forth. Besides the printed text, a manuscript copy of Specimen, only one manuscript copy of Specimen survives as it was prepared for publication in Frankfurt. The manuscript is in fact not very informative because it is essentially identical to the printed volume, but includes some materials that were left out in the printing process. For instance, this image, which was presumably intended as a frontispiece illustration. In fact, you see the cartouche for the title, but it was not used in the actual translation. The volume is divided in 6 sections, and there you see the Latin titles with the my translation. So we have identified, so I'm going to describe the work that we did on this text, especially parts of this text. So first of all, we have identified the Chinese origin, and it hadn't been done before, so this was our first task. We have identified the Chinese original of part 1 and part 5a. You see them highlighted in yellow on the screen. So the 4 books on the pulses and the method of healing or rule of healing for the explaining process. These 2 texts belong together in the source text. So once we identified the text for one, we found the other one too. So we're probably translated together, but ended up separated arbitrarily at some stage in the book's production. So the original of these 2 sections is a 16th century Pulse text, the Tuju Majuabian Gen, which means we translate as differentiation of the genuine in the rhymes for pulses illustrated with commentary. In the translation, the text is wrongly attributed to Wang Xue, the author of the early pulse classic, the Manji, the Canon of the Pulses, which is a very important early classic of Chinese medicine. But in fact, the Tuju Majuabian Gen, that was translated, is an exemplar of the so-called Majua family of texts. So a subgenre of pulse literature. Majua means pulse rhymes. And what characterizes this genre or subgenre is that it's written in verses, so with rhymes, as an aid for memorization, and also has visual representations of the pulse types. So it's rhymes and illustration. So it's a kind of a popular kind of text. So clearly the translator chose a text that was kind of, middle level, not a difficult ancient text, but a recent text that was meant for a wide readership in China. In the source for specimen, these images, we worked on these images, and we see in the text, the original text, the Chinese text, the images accompany the textual description of each pulse, and were also assembled together in a table, tables in this literature. And you see here, I have highlighted in pink or red the image to the right, the top right. It's the image of the so-called floating pulse, pulsus natans. Now, what did the translator do with this kind of images? He dropped the table, here it doesn't have the table, but followed the source text in placing each image next to the passage on the corresponding pulse types. Moreover, and most strikingly, he offered not one, but 3 images for each pulse. One from a very ancient codex, Ex Antiquissimo Codice, as you see there, to the left. Then the image in the middle, Ex Modernis, so from the text that he translated. And finally, the third one, which we haven't been able to identify so much. We haven't identified the sources of that. This is very frustrating. It seems, therefore, that interestingly, he did some philological research on the text, trying to collate, to find also manuscripts with different pulse illustrations from different sources. The Tuju Gen had an appendix of recipes, formulas, for each different pulse diagnosis and related disease. So it's structured like this. There's a kind of pulse, so the floating pulse, and then below there are 2, 3, 4 recipes for that kind of pulse. Very practice-oriented. So we have identified this appendix as the source for the sectional specimen on formulas. So 5A, the leading rule for the explained pulses. As you see, it's attributed to Rachel, that's fine. And so these 2 parts, were quite clear. We have the original, we have the Latin translation, we can compare, and we are working on it. In specimen, the section on formulas is followed by a list of the tailor-made items, which you see there highlighted in blue, medicinal symbols that the Chinese use for healing purposes. This is a list of material, rhubarb, whatever. We were lucky enough to find a manuscript draft of this, of the research that went into the making of this list. In this manuscript, the name is, as I hope you can see, but you can see that the name for each item is in Chinese. Now, this was very useful to find this because the printed text of specimen has absolutely no Chinese character, because it was very difficult at that time in Europe to print. Maybe it didn't involve, I think, as far as I know, it's the only example. It was very difficult to print Chinese characters in Europe. And the publication of specimen was pretty cheap. You would spend, I think they did put very many resources into it. So by finding this manuscript, we were absolutely sure, what each item was in the Chinese, in Chinese. So after the Chinese text, what you have is the romanization, so a phonetic transcription, okay, which is the one that was used by the Portuguese. They're different. The Jesuits, they all have different transcription techniques, and it's quite difficult. In fact, sometimes, for instance, just with the transcription, Martha could not get to the Chinese. So it was really crucial to find the as it often is. We have newly identified the Chinese source for this list, which we're sure, so this list clearly was based on some Chinese Benzao text, so the material medical text. Which one? Because they are legion, so many. So now we have identified the Chinese source for the list, which we're sure is the very same copy that the translator used because it is annotated by the same hand. So the hand who wrote this, manuscript also annotated this text. The so-called that one Benzao in a 16th century copy, in a 16th century reprint, updated reprint, which is also like the manuscript originally was. The manuscript is now in Poland, but it was originally in Berlin, and this book, that one that's out, is still in the study in Berlin. So together, these three sources, as you see them there, so the Chinese original, the manuscript which represents the research notes, basically, that were done on the manuscripts, and the printed text, give us a glimpse into the research process that went into the making of this person. And now I come to the issue of authorship. Who translated, or otherwise wrote, the texts assembled in specimen? The title page, as we know, only mentions, as you see there, edited Andreas Kleyer. So only Andreas Kleyer is mentioned. Who was Andreas Kleyer? Andreas Kleyer was a German medical practitioner in the service of the Dutch East India Company in Batavia. So he wasn't in China, he never was in China, but he was in Batavia. It is certain that Kleyer was only the editor of the book. He admitted as much himself in a prefatory letter to Specimen, where he says that his role had been limited to acquiring and putting together the texts, for the quote, this is what he says, with my own work and at my own expenses. So he actually bought these texts. Unfortunately, this document was not included in the printed text. It is in the manuscript, but not in the printed text. And this led to the wrong attribution of the book's authorship to Kleyer and consequent accusations of plagiarism against him. And this querelle on the authorship of Kleyer or somebody else started already in 1740. So already in the 18th century, they started debating this, and it goes on and on and on. With the Jesuits, of course, say no. So there's a lot of, and the Germans say no, it's Kleyer. So there's a lot of, pride, nationalistic pride involved here, or religious pride involved. So Kleyer arrived, let's see who Kleyer was a little bit more. Kleyer arrived in Batavia in 1662. He was first employed by the Dutch East India Company as a soldier. He worked his way up in the settlement by running the company's apothecary shop and eventually holding the position of protomedicus, that is, the person in charge of regulating medical practice in the city. Kleyer was no scholar. He did not have a medical doctorate, but only a license to practice medicine. So he was a low-level medical practitioner. For instance, his Latin is quite iffy. Usually when he writes something, he writes in German, and then gets it translated as he read Latin, but his active Latin wasn't so good. His location in Batavia allowed him, however, to develop an interest in Eastern and Chinese medicine, especially local Latin America. He was also intellectually curious about Chinese culture in general. In a letter of 1669, for instance, he claimed he had read withal, and that's his expression, withal. A book called Sapientia Sinica, which is the first Latin translation of Confucius by the Jesuits, which had been printed in China in 1660. For years, and this was done by the Jesuits, and specifically by Prospero Intorcetta, by the Jesuit Prospero Intorcetta. For years, Kleyer collected Chinese medical texts, and knowing no Chinese, tried to find a translator among the Jesuits who stopped in Batavia on their way to and from China, because they actually, they wouldn't just go, they would go and they come back for a mission in Rome and so on and so forth. So here I show you, just to give you a sense of what's involved. Usually the Jesuits start from Lisbon, where all the so-called indipete, so the young Jesuits who desired the Indies, that's what the term indipeta means, would collect in Lisbon, and there they would be trained and they would be given instructions, including in some Chinese, but only some. And then they would go to India, to Goa. From there, over Indonesia, and here I didn't find a map with with Batavia there, so that Batavia is Jakarta, so the island of Java below Malacca. And then from there to Macau, which, as I said, was the port of entry into China, or they would go to Japan. Clier, in Batavia, met Jesuits regularly, and he tried to enlist one of them in translating of this Chinese text that they had collected. And he did find an exceptionally gifted translator, and it's this one, Philippe Couplet, who turns out to have played a major role in the genesis of specimen. Philippe Couplet has been called the man who brought China to Europe, and indeed he did introduce Confucius to the West. He was one of the authors of the first Latin translation of the Confucian canon, the first three books of the Confucian canon, text called Confucius Sinarum Philosophus, which he Couplet personally brought to Europe and published in Paris in 1687. And this was a very, very important text, of course. Couplet turns out also to have been one of the main actors in the making of specimen. We find decisive information to this effect in his correspondence. In 1656-58, the young Couplet, in his early 20s, traveled for the first time to China, from Lisbon to China, with other Jesuits, the group, of course. Among them, Michael Boyn, the author of Flora Sinensis, so the author of the first book on Chinese body. Boyn is another extraordinary figure. Each of these persons really could write novels. Boyn was coming back from a diplomatic mission in Europe, where he tried unsuccessfully to rally the support of the Pope and the European princes on the side of the Ming against the Manchu invaders. These are decisive years in the political history of China when the Ming dynasty collapses and is replaced with, the Qing dynasty with the Manchu. So they're years of war and confusion and chaos. And the Jesuits actually sided some with the Ming and some with the Manchu, kind of cleverly. And so Boyd sided with the losing side. Before they parted in Siam, in Thailand, Boyd entrusted Couplet with the manuscript of a book on Chinese medicine, which he had written with the hope of printing in Europe. Couplet's testimony in this respect is confirmed by a letter by Boyd himself from 1658, where he wrote, quote, "I'm sending to the Low Countries a book to be published under the title Medicus Sinicus, so the Chinese physician. A book of great utility, which I translated from the Chinese. It surely cost me much labor and has been solicited by many in Europe." It's a nice notation because it means that there was a ready readership for this text. Boyd died soon thereafter, in 1659. His Medicus Sinicus, for several years, seemed to vanish without leaving any trace. Specimen Medicinae Sinicae was published in 1688 with no mention whatsoever in any part of the book. Several years later, however, in a letter to the German physician Christian Menzel, Couplet explained what had happened to Boyd's Medicus Sinicus, providing also crucial evidence on the origins of the texts that Clier had put together in specimen. Quote, "All that Clier wrote on the pulses, everything that was published in the first printing, that is, specimen, the specimen came out in 1682, was in part sent to him by me from China, and in part came from the book of Mikhail Boyn. I had sent Boyn's book from the kingdom of Siam to New Batavia in the year 1658, so that from there it could be shipped to Europe. But because the Dutch were angry at the rejection and despaired success of the embassy that they had tried to send to the Beijing court, they threw out the whole book, some fragments of which were later collected by clients. So the story of the book is completely interwoven with the political history of this period, and how the Jesuits and the Dutch are related to each other. According to Couplet, therefore, parts of but in terms of what this letter tells us about the authorship of the text, the letter tells you that parts of the texts published in Specimen were by Couplet himself, and parts came from the book that Boyn had given him for publication in 1658. So let's go back to, sorry, I forgot to show you this slide, which simply sums up the things I've just told you. So now on the specimen. So here we have tried to, give an author to each of these parts, okay? And so, for which parts of the book are we sure that we know the author? Well, for example, section 4, the letters, excerpts from the letters of a European scholar in China, we're almost 99% sure that this European scholar is Couplet himself, because we know that Couplet had corresponded in those years, in fact, even later, and in fact, some letters, not these letters, but other letters survive. So we're sure for that. But we're also reasonably certain that Boyn was the author of the Latin translation of the Chinese text we have identified as the Tujun, and Gianna, including the appendix of formulas. So section 1 and 5A. Okay, so those are by name, very, very likely. Although Couplet might have been editing this translation. We're especially certain because the attribution is certain because Boyn wrote in 1658 that he had translated a Liber Receptarium Sinensium, so a book of Chinese recipes, which can only be the formula section of Specimen. In the same occasion, Boyn declared that he had intended to prepare a Chinese herbarium with descriptions of Chinese medicinal plants as a companion to the book of Chinese recipes, because of course you've got the ingredients in the recipes, but if you don't know what these ingredients are, because you don't have the Chinese materia medica, you can't do anything, right? So, so he says in 1658, Boyn says, I wanted to do this, I haven't had time, I have to do it later on. But since he died soon thereafter, we must conclude that he was not the author of this section on medicinal symbols, at least must have been added later by somebody else. We have found conclusive evidence that this person was indeed Philip Couplet. As we know, Couplet had access to Boyn's book manuscript already in 1658. He corresponded with Clier from the late 1660s to the early 1680s, and by Clier's own admission, gave him much material on Chinese medicine, including a Chinese herbarium, which could be there. The decisive evidence, however, is the hard fact that the notes on the copy of the Wanbei, which, as we know, is the Chinese source for the medicamenta, for the medicinal symbols section, are unmistakably in Couplet's hand. So Couplet is the person who studied this manuscript and then selected items, didn't translate all of it, but he selected items in this list with the Chinese character and the phonetic transcription or romanization and a brief Latin description, which is often very close to the we're working on this text, right? These two texts right now, and it looks like it's often just a summary, but very close to the Chinese original. So he did understand it for this way. We know that he annotated the copy that went himself, and also the manuscript is also in Couplet's hand. So this really clinches the matter, so to speak, in the sense that we are, as certain as one can possibly humanly be that this was done by Couplet. So, all this evidence clearly indicates that Couplet completed the work left unfinished by Bowen, possibly prompted by the Jesuit ethos of collaborative authorship, which is also very important to understand the work of the Jesuits, that they, not only they cooperated, but it's impossible to reduce their work to individual authorship because it's often collective authorship, collaborative and collective. Yet more evidence, however, comes from a book that came out 4 years later after the specimen, this time with full recognition of Bowen's authorship. Claris Medica Alcinarum Doctrina Repulsibus, a medical key to the Chinese doctrine of the fossils. The book came out in 1686, so 4 years later. On the title page, the book was presented as, I quote, an exemplar of Bowen's whole work, which was buried for more than 20 years and scattered here and there, and which Andreas Klayer, Zotomedicus of the Dutch East India Company, assembled and published for the sake of the European physicians. This was a clear acknowledgement that the disjointed parts of Bowen's work had already been published as specimens. The frontispiece also specified that the text, as you can see, had been recently brought from China and amended from errors by the Jesuit figure. So much for the authorship. Now we come to the publication, the history of the publication. The miscellaneous nature of specimen was not only due to the precarious circumstances of its genesis, but also of its publication. Neither Clavier nor Couplet, nor the Latin in Europe at the time, could supervise the printing process, which meant many difficulties. Specimen was published under the auspices of the German Academia which is a very interesting society of physicians devoted to the Laconian program of collecting and sharing experiential knowledge of medicine and natural history. And they looked for this kind of knowledge all over the world. So it wasn't limited just to. The Academia published its own periodical, the Miscellanea Curiosa, which has the distinction of being the first medical journal or medical periodical published in Europe. The model was, of course, the transactions of the Royal Society, but for medicine and natural history. So there is a thematic focus. The Academia's members were very interested in exotic materia medica and non-European healing practices. Clarius corresponded with them from Batavia and was admitted to the Academia as a fellow in 1678 under the name of Dioscorides. So that's the persona, the epistemic persona that he chose. In 1679, Clarius sent a manuscript of specimen, and the book was published in Frankfurt under the supervision of a member of the Academia, the physician Sebastian Schäfer, while another academician in the Berlin court doctor and sinologist Christian Menzel was also involved, though at a distance, in the publication process. So here you see a synthesis of what I just told you on specimens publication. 4 years later, the publication of Bowen's Clavis was again sponsored by the Academia, and the work came out in 1686 as an appendix to the periodical, to the journal, the Miscellanea Curiosa, which had a European readership, so that was important for reception. We need an effort of historical imagination to picture the journey between China and Europe in the early modern age. It could take up to 2 years, often with lengthy stops along the way, and it meant facing innumerable dangers, quite possibly death. Both Bowen and Couplet died when they were traveling back to China from Europe. born in 1659 in southern China, broken by the failure of his diplomatic mission in Rome, desperate and lonely, except for a faithful Chinese companion and convert who stayed with him. The old couplet, he was in his early 70s, in 1693, returning to China from Europe at the very end of his journey in a storm off the coast of Goa as the ship was about to reach the harbor. The intercourse between Chinese and Europeans, even when they established ties of friendship, was often marked by a sense of nearly insurmountable distance. We can sense it in this poem that the literatus Chen wrote for a Jesuit, François de Rougemont. To the foreigner master Lu from the Far West, Lu was the Chinese name of Rougemont. They all got the Chinese name. These are amazing. Oh my, how very fantastic and incredible. The places you passed through, noxious vapors of Siam, thick fogs of honor. You rode crashing waves 90,000 miles to come. Sea turtles, your companions. Ocean beyond oceans, light like lacquer. Country beyond countries, sky with no sun. You were startled at your strange eyes. Specimen managed to cross this nearly insurmountable distance, but its journey from China to Batavia to Frankfurt was strewn with obstacles and difficulties. Its publication was a case of fortunate survival. Much more, I'm sure, was lost in this field. Fortunate survival for what Martin Wilson has called precarious knowledge threatened by the perilous circumstances in which it is acquired and transmitted. The appearance of the book in European print required the transnational linking and collaboration of at least 3 sets of people across the globe. Some Jesuits in the China mission, such as the Polish Boeing and the Flemish Couplet, of course the Jesuits were coming from Europe, who faced, with the assistance of Chinese literati, the daunting intellectual task of disclosing Chinese medical ideas to European readers. Some medical practitioners of the Dutch East India Company in Batavia, such as the German Kleyer, who combined a keen intellectual interest in Eastern Batavian medical and healing practices with a shrewd vision of the advantages to be found in transferring them to Europe. And finally, on the receiving end of the network, an association of learned physicians such as Schaefer and Menzel, willing to sponsor the acquisition and dissemination of non-European knowledge. And of course, this couldn't be taken for granted. Although the book had a mixed reception in Europe, it nonetheless was and remains a milestone of cross-cultural medical history. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Gianna. Very, very interesting and enjoyable when you presented it as a quest. It was, I'm sure it was. We could really see how much investigative work there was behind these results and perhaps the future results that you work with. I have a lot of comments and questions, and I don't know if, go ahead, Rudy, you can start. Yeah.
Thanks for the wonderful presentation. I was curious to know if in your research you encountered some recurring or very peculiar metaphors.
Metaphors?
Yes.
In the text?
Yes.
Okay, in the text that we had we started with the formulas, strange enough, but we thought, well, this was also because I'm interested in what I call epistemic genres. So not literary genres, but genres that are used for transmitting, for recording and transmitting knowledge. And obviously, epistemic genres exist at the transnational, transcultural level, like you have the Bensaus and you have the medical text. Clearly, it's a similar genre. And so formulas, I thought, well, recipes also exist at the transcultural level. So we started from that. When we work on the text, again, our focus was especially on translation, but Bowen seems to have studies of translation argues cross-cultural translation between cultures that are really far from each other, argue that there are two main techniques or strategies. One is a domesticizing strategy, and one is an exoticizing strategy. Domesticizing, you try to stress the similarities between what you find in the original text and your own culture, and you build on those similarities to translate. Exoticizing, on the contrary, you underline the exotic and so the differences, okay? And there are two different strategies. Now, Bowen certainly used the domesticizing strategy. So he takes concepts for yin and yang, for instance, and he translates them, interestingly, with terms that were absolutely fundamental in the metaphysics and in the metaphysical foundation of European, Greco-Roman, also Arabic, philosophical and medical tradition, care dominatum et nullum radicale. So the innate heat and the radical moisture. These are just, incredible concepts that you find in Aristotle, you find in Galen, you find them in Avicenna, you find them still discussed in the 16th century and early 17th century. And by natural philosophers, by physicians, and so on and so forth. And there, I think it's difficult to say, but he also uses them as metaphors, as they're also used in the original text, I think. So he doesn't seem to, he tries to be faithful, he is a scholar, so he's really trying to be faithful to the text. So he doesn't invent metaphors, or we haven't found examples of European metaphors projected onto the original text. But he does he tries to understand Chinese concepts in a way that he thinks is basically based, and there is a theory behind it. He thinks that there is that the Chinese have preserved a prisca sapientia or prisca theologia, which in Europe has been forgotten. And so, there in China, they're finding it again. So this revelation knowledge that the Chinese have been able to preserve. And so it makes perfect sense to be as careful as possible in translating and in understanding, because we want to really be authentic, right? We don't want to change it. However, it's quite interesting. In fact, one thing we could write, but I don't know if we ever will, because it would be very difficult, is to look at different translations by other Jesuits of Indiana.
Yeah.
Because, for instance, Aleni, who was perhaps he wasn't a physician, and he was more interested in natural philosophy, he was more of a natural philosopher, he translated them differently. So it would be very, very interesting. Metaphors, metaphors that seem to be in the text, but it doesn't seem to bring metaphors of his own to the text. At least that's what we really haven't looked at this issue, how can I say, sentence after sentence and page after page in this text.
Of course, the answers depend on the question, so...
Yeah.
Sure. One thing that he does, sometimes he drops metaphors, that are in the original text, and that he probably thought were going to be a stumbling block for European readers. And he wants really to communicate this stuff. So his main effort is to be faithful, he has to get it really right, but once he's got it right, he has to bring it to you as pure as possible. And so once it drops, and it has to do with metaphors of the body. In fact, when you asked me to contribute, I thought it was hard to go to that, but then I had no time. But in the recipes, now the Chinese recipe is a fascinating structure where the list of ingredients is the ingredients, first ingredient, second ingredient, third, the first four are given the names of officials at the emperor's court. Okay? So the political structure of the empire is there printed as a mark on the recipe, on the formula, right? Which is absolutely fascinating. And that's why, in a way, we started with formulas and recipes because they seem to be very simple. But and in a way, they are simple, but they're also incredibly complex. And they certainly are shaped by the political context. Now, there's no trace of that in Bowling. It drops there. So what you get when you look at, I wish I had a page from that section of the specimen. I probably do have it somewhere, but I don't know. I would have to waste time looking for it. You have something that looks exactly like any formula in any European medical text. And that's one reason why we started with that section was that the first time I kind of, just out of curiosity, I looked at the book and these are recipes. But this is Chinese medicine. What's going on? Because, when you go over, for instance, European case collections, I have done a lot of work on case collections. What you notice the recipes because they are printed vertically, so they stand out, also typographically. It's quite clear, because these people have so much to read, so they wanted to find the recipe quickly, and you find it typographically. Whereas, for instance, in medieval manuscripts, as far as I know, it's not like that. So it's something that is introduced with printing. As a typographical device that is going to have the reader, the medical reader, get quickly the information is looking for. So, then the Chinese, of course, everything in Chinese is written vertically, so that wasn't the problem for both. But the name of one of the, I don't remember exactly the names of the different officers, but one, for instance, is the interpreter. And that is, none of that is there. It just has a recipe, a Chinese recipe, that looks exactly like a European recipe. And I'm sure that was part of the message. Part of the message was, well, look, you can really use this stuff. Yeah.
So in a way, the political metaphor, the political structure is the basic template for understanding something practical, like the symbols.
In China.
We've seen this in a couple of examples before, but okay, you have Anna and then Giorgio.
Well, thank you so much. That was fascinating, and I also would have many questions. But since I'm so fascinated by your quest, by this quest that you showed us, so my question would be: at the end, you said the specimen had a mixed reception, and I'd be quite interested in the reception. If you could just tell us a little bit. Did it shape, European ideas of China and its medicine? Or, if you could tell us a little.
Sure. That's a great question, of course. We have looked a little bit into that. Fortunately, there are two good books. One by a French historian of Chinese medicine, especially post-medicine, Eric Marier. He's written a book on some of these translations, but he didn't figure out all this stuff, so it was work for us to do. And he has looked into the reception a bit, because this also is a lot of work to do. And then there is another essay on the history of Chinese phlegmology in Europe that has been written by the great historian of medicine, but it's very much written in a traditional history of medicine perspective, history of phlegmology that already tells you. Whereas, in fact, there are lots of sources in this respect, and maybe I can find specimens reception, as I anticipated this question. So I prepared a couple of slices. So the reception was mixed, as I said. So there was tremendous interest. For instance, Christian Menzel, who was the court physician in Berlin, was very interested as a physician, but especially as a sinologist. Because he wanted to learn Chinese, he was working on Chinese encyclopedias and dictionaries. And how does he work specimen? How does he use specimen? He uses especially the medicamentos in section. So the because Manson was writing at that time a book called Peanuts, a table of all botanical knowledge around the world. These people were incredibly daring in a way, or maybe in a foolish way, but they were very daring. And so he put together this book, which is a list of material items, plants mostly, with the terminology, the name of that item in all the languages he could find evidence for. All of them. And of course, for Chinese, he uses Clare because he thought erroneously that Clare was the author. And then also because of that, everybody is, error is transmitted and repeated. So everybody kept saying Clare wrote this, and it wasn't true. So clearly he saw specimen as a very useful book. However, when he first got it, and he was really eagerly waiting for this text from Frankfurt, there's a letter that says, this is, one cannot understand anything, this is obscure, this is superstition, what is this? So the first reaction was negative. And clearly the miscellaneous structure doesn't have. There's no introduction. And Boyle had written several introductions which were published later with Clarence, but the specimen they were not there. So his reception at first was negative, but then he kind of, and also what we found in Berlin are fascinating manuscripts by Menzel himself, where he copies illustrations from specimens, and then he writes the Chinese characters. So he's kind of learning from the book. So it's very, very moving. But then, just as an example of a negative reaction, it came out in the very same year when Clavis Medica, and it's a reception of Clavis, but it's basically the same thing, where Pierre Bell, the author of the Dictionnaire, Critical Historical Dictionary, Bell wrote, I'll read it to you, we would much admire the principles of Chinese medicine if they had been presented to us when we were under the sway of Aristotelian philosophy. Unfortunately, the Chinese theories have reached Europe right at the time when the foundations of mechanical philosophy have made us adverse to Canidum Minatum and Numinum Radicale, which are the foundational concepts of Chinese medicine as well as of peripatetic philosophy. So this is Aristotelian stuff. We don't want Aristotle from China. Thank you very much. Okay, so that's the Bell's reaction. But of course, Bell is particular figure. But that's quite interesting. However, what we find, and the fact that this was also found out already by Duramek and Allier, is that because of course that the story is even more complicated, because then in the beginning of the 18th century, the same text, the Tuju Major gets translated into French by French Jesuits. And we wrote about that in another article. But at that point, the French Jesuits are very, because they think that specimen and Clavis were too obscure, so they had to do a better translation. And they do that, and the translation gets published in L'Ars Description de la Chine, which is a book, an encyclopedia of Chinese things that is translated in all European languages, basically. So extremely influential in shaping the European understanding, vision, knowledge of Chinese culture. And so at that point, they're still thinking that it would be very useful to understand Chinese pulse medicine and Chinese botany. So they also translate the section of the most important things out. So they're still doing that. And at the end of the 18th century, talking about reception, there is a correspondence between a French physician in Paris and a Jesuit in China. And the French physician writes, I have been working on pulse medicine for 20 years using or trying to use the Chinese method. And he writes to the Jesuit, can you please interview a Chinese physician for me? And he sends questions. Okay, and the Jesuit, very kindly, of course they always try to keep a good connection with Europe, and the Jesuit replies. So this is end of the 18th century. So there's a lot, and there might be more. And each European country, for instance, L'Essai de la Médecine Chinoise was translated into Italian very soon after it came out. I haven't even looked at this text. You know, it's like there's so much that and in England, of course, is another country where and the Netherlands. So it's a very complex story. So I'm sorry I cannot just tell you a little bit, but it's a mixed bag. Yes, it's positive and it's negative. And then of course in the 19th century it goes on a little, but the whole attitude of Europeans to the rest of the world changes dramatically in the sense that it becomes imperialistic, negative, and so on and so forth. So that really changes things.
Yeah. I remember reading a book about the transmission of knowledge about Zen and from Japan via the Jesuit missions to Europe, and there too Pierre Bell played a very important role. So he is clearly a key figure because of his interest for what is happening in Asia, in East Asia, but also because of the enormous, the compilation nature of the encyclopedia, of the dictionary, but also the fact that it has a lot of philosophical reflection behind it, and it's so widely read. So, okay, Giorgio.
Just a simple question. I wanted to kind of ask what kind of apparatus, if any, comes with the text. Are there cross-references to works of European medicine?
No, because the text that we are examining is a translation, so there are lots of references to Chinese authors, yes.
No, but in the apparatus of the text, of the printed text that's produced, is there any apparatus?
No, because the problem is that, Clary wouldn't have been up to that task, because, as I said, he is not a scholar, he's not so. Couplet was very busy. First of all, he was, so specimen comes out in 1682. In 1682, Couplet was in Batavia, and he was traveling from China to Rome. Rome was the destination, because these are also the years of the rights controversy, in which the Jesuits are accused in the Vatican of being too accommodating to the Chinese, and of giving this, interpretation of Christianity, which is too Chinese. It's not right. And of course, all these people going, Couplet, like Matteo Ricci, they are all on the side of accommodation. They know that they have to accommodate. I mean, they're doing the work. If you're there in China, you know that you have to respect the Chinese. That's very strong in Boeing. Very strong. Very often he says, let's speak, that's why the translation is so important for him. Let's listen to the Chinese. This is what the Chinese say very, very often. So yes, it's a difficult moment for them. And Couplet, I don't think that the medical part of his work was as important as the Confucius Syllabus philosophers. That was really the most important for him. And he did manage to publish that under his supervision in Paris in 1687. The publication of specimen, he was in Batavia, there was nothing he could do. And probably when he saw the text, he thought, oh my God, yeah, this is a mess, because it looks like a mess. And that's why he insisted on publishing twice. Especially also because he really, of course, the Jesuits are all for collective authorship, but not, to be ignored completely, and the authorship being attributed to Clary was a bit too much. And it didn't matter for him. He never presents himself as an author, but he wanted Boeing's authorship to be recognized. So, apparatus, no. And it's clearly a poor kind of publication. For instance, the images are also poorly rendered. They didn't spend, the Accademia Naturale Curiosum didn't put very much effort into it. Too bad.
So I'll take the privilege of chairing for asking a couple of questions myself before I get to you, Lina. I was thinking, I anticipated this by email, that one of the things we read in our working group is a very new scholarship about another global age, not the first, as this book claims, the very first, which is sort of the Mongol age. So now there is a substantial scholarship that has proved that the circulation of objects, of people, and of knowledge in that period is substantial enough to talk about a form of globalization. And what is striking is that of all the types of knowledge that circulate, medical knowledge is very prominent. Despite the fact that already in the late 13th and early 14th century, there is a real divide between Galenic systems in West Eurasia and non-Galenic Chinese systems in East Asia. But some authors, Paul Buell and others, have argued strongly that actually there is already a first wave of intermingling that goes in the other direction. It's a sort of mostly Arabic medicine that is translated and adapted. Exactly. And there too, however, when you go and read the treatise that Buell has edited and is worked on, the most immediately striking thing is how important the materia medica is, and how sort of the interest, the practical interest in it, somehow perhaps functions as a vector to bridge systems that, if they had to be compared at the abstract level or the theoretical principles level, would find it difficult to communicate, because there are two different concepts of the body, of the organs. There's quite a lot that is different. So, would you say that for these authors in the 17th century, the practical nature of the bit of Chinese medicine that they choose to translate and that they choose to transmit is a sort of bridge, testa di ponte, or a broader transmission? So they transmit the more practical, recipe-oriented, in order to give a glimpse of a system that would be too difficult to present in its theoretical underpinnings. You said, for example, about this idea of prisca theologia, which it's a 15th century humanist concept. Even then, it was used as a way to acknowledge other religious systems without being accused of being unchristian, fundamentally. So there is an element here of trying to circumvent censorship and accusations potentially of heresy in their case, or of having exaggerated. And in this respect, then, as historians of transmission of knowledge, should we reflect more on the specific nature of practical knowledge? That in a sense, the practical knowledge is more easily transmitted, even though it has its own theoretical underpinnings, but you can sort of ignore them, you can sort of slip them under the rug, so to speak.
But that's what Harold Cook in his book Matters of Exchange has argued. There's a chapter called Translating What Works. So it doesn't matter what's the philosophy, the technology, but they were looking after, and some people certainly, like I think Claudia, although when I found this letter with Claudia said, I read some agencies in law, I kind of thought, well, it's more interesting. No, I think you're right. There is that, but I would say with Paul, there was very clearly engaged with the philosophical dimension of the text. Head on, he just loved it. He just wanted to deal with that. But I want to say something on this issue of first global age, second global age, whatever. So of course, we are modernists call it the first global age. I could call it like that in this book. But of course, yes, it's absolutely true that the exchange, especially between the Middle East and all the, medicine in India, all the contact with India is obviously very, very important. And so, Greco-Roman Arabic medicine certainly arrived there in Aden, So, at the same time, it seems to me that the so-called about first or second global age, the intensity of the networks and the exchange is much stronger.
In Europe, for sure, because if you put yourself in Iran, perhaps the first global age is more relevant than the second, so to speak. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So much so that when we look, because one thing that struck us at first was that both the Latin translation and the French translation in the 17th and the 18th century were done on the same text. And then we discovered that actually the very first translation that we know of this text was into Persian. And it was done in tablets at the beginning of the 14th century by Rashid al-Din. So by somebody who was very, very important. However, if you look at, of course, there we have absolutely no way of going beyond the secondary literature. So we wrote an essay on these three translations, the Persian, the Latin, and the French. Why always the same text? Because we felt, it's another fact, that she could bring the knowledge about this Tuju Major because she can read it. And often all this literature, you just concentrate on the Persian source or the Latin source to have you need a team. So you need something like what you're doing, of having a group of people and collective work. So the translation of the Persian translation of the Tuju Major was basically a failure, and that's how it is described. So there's only one manuscript, only one. And that in itself tells you that it didn't circulate much. And according to the scholars who have studied it, or they say that Rashid al-Din had this very ambitious project. He was going to do for the Chinese the same thing that had been done in Baghdad for Greco-Roman texts, but it didn't happen.
Or it happened partially.
It happened partially. So, it's a really complex story. And the fact that even in the case of Rashid al-Din, what they select, or what they selected, we don't know, they didn't do it themselves. They had a team that worked on it. He still chose this practice. A text that compared with the, the Emperor's canon or the canon of Paucis is much more practice-oriented, has illustrations and so on and so forth. And in fact, the Persian translators try to keep the rhymes, so the poetic aspect, some illustrations, but we examine several aspects that change in the three translations. But yes, of course, yes, there was this background.
I think there is an interesting assumption. We discussed these things very, very generally in September, that in a way the real globalization, when it starts, is a irreversible process, and it's a progressive process. And I think talking about first globalization in the Middle Ages introduces the rather interesting prospect, which I think we're all living through now. The globalizations can also fail, stop, and retreat. Right? Yes. So in a way, for a very long time, the understanding of global history as starting in the early modern period was, first of all, Eurocentric. Second of all, had this assumption of a process that continues to grow. And this is perhaps something that even the failure of Rashid al-Din's project, although in a way it may well be that it was less of a failure than we know, it's simply that what happened to manuscripts and to the fact that the printing didn't spread in that area of the world for so many centuries might have had an effect on survival. Most of the manuscripts that matter are in Europe, some are in Istanbul, and that's pretty much as far east as they go. Everything that was kept in Asia, we don't know, so nobody knows where they are.
It's true. We're just scratching the surface in a way. That's what I feel often, that we are scratching the surface, in spite of the fact that it is wonderful secondary literature, so at this point. But, for instance, a lot of it is in Japanese.
Yeah.
And Marta reads it, but also, you don't have time to
Absolutely.
control all this amazing mass.
Yeah. It's something we have discussed many times.
I'm sure it's a challenge.
It is, and it's impossible to control everything. So one does it. Indeed, thank you so much. So, Odie.
Yeah, actually, my question was also about the specimen engagement with or interest in the theoretical or philosophical underpinnings of the process being laid out, and where that might be coming from. And I don't know whether the answer you gave to Giorgio might partly go in that direction, or in the direction of answering that question about, whether if this might be about accommodation, or whether there is a kind of a confessional slant to this attention to these things. But I don't know anything about the kind of Chinese cosmology, so I don't know whether it, to what extent philosophy and religion kind of overlap and in what ways.
Yeah, I think what matters a lot in this case is, the fact that the Jesuits did not have medicine in the Ratio Studiorum. So medicine, philosophy, yes, but medicine was not a topic that they were supposed to study. However, in the mission, they were asked for medical help. And so they realized that this was a point of entry. Now, the first thing, more important than that was astronomy, as you know. So that's how they get established at the Beijing court, also the court of Kanjis, because they can reform the calendar, and the emperor is very interested in mathematics and so on and so forth. But medicine is very important for missionary activities, because you help people, and so you create a human contact with people. What happens is that they start writing, the Jesuit Father General writes letters to Rome saying, send people who know some medicine, okay? And like at first, somebody like Shrek was really rara avis, there weren't very many Jesuits with that kind of knowledge of medicine and so on and so forth. In Boyne's case, Boyne was also a bit rara avis because he was the doctor of a physician, in fact, of the court physician of the King of Poland. So he came from, an important family, and he had studied some medicine in his youth before becoming a Jesuit. So clearly he had some medical background, and the medical background in this period is philosophical background. You studied philosophy. There was no way you could learn medicine at the academic in a university without reading philosophy and taking philosophy very, very seriously, in spite of the fact that there are lots and lots of contradictions between Aristotelian and Hellenic views of the body, for instance, especially of the gendered body, two completely different theories of generation, for instance. But at the same time, this was just like the luggage that you brought with you to China, in the case of Boyne, was certainly also philosophical. So clearly he is engaged by the text also at the philosophical level. Now, of course, I just said a little bit about this yin and yang thing, but that, of course, is not gender, because the feminine and the masculine those concepts in Chinese culture are linked to. So, how does Boyne deal with that? The honest answer is I don't know, because I haven't looked at it yet, but it's probably there. And just as some of you were talking about, kind of being surprised and looking for a gender element, then finding it, even in texts like, theology or economy and so on and so forth, where you don't expect this kind of thing. And you find it all between the lines, so it is there.
Okay. If there are no other questions, then I would suggest that we thank very much Gianna for this interesting new paper, and all of you for staying with us and for the discussion. Some of us will meet later tonight for dinner at 8 p.m. And others, unfortunately, Gianna and her husband as well, will not be with us.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. So thank you very much for coming to Turin for this day, and I hope we'll stay in touch. We'll let you know how the further activities of the project develop, and if there is anything that
I'd love to hear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so thank you again.
issue on reserve, and I'm just trying to get through what everything is like handwritten all the time, and it was an issue for me, so I really really hard, and now it's become this mess.
Come on, this mess. What is this?
Yeah, because, because I know what it used to be, and it's degenerated completely. Pretty nice though, you know.